If your podcast is for everyone, I've got bad news for you. It's probably for no one. Let me say that again. If your podcast is for everyone, then it's probably for no one. So what do I mean by that? Well, the fastest way to grow your podcast isn't talking more and just talking about random things. The fastest and quickest way to grow your podcast is to pick a niche or niche and pick it early on. They say there's a saying, and it's the riches are in the niches. Maybe that's true. Or the riches are in the niches. But anyways, you get my point. You are going to find and have more followers, more listeners if you have a niche. It's not just getting out there and just talking about whatever you want. Because let's be honest, if you are a realtor in Orange County, California, and specifically in a certain city, let's just say San Clemente, California, your podcast needs to be about real estate in San Clemente, California. Your social media, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you use, that can be a little more broad, a little more general. But if you really want to have a podcast that grows and a podcast where you can take clips from your podcast and turn them into reels and shorts, then having a niche is going to be the most beneficial, smartest, best thing you can do right out of the gate. So before you even hit record on a podcast, know exactly and specifically what you're going to talk about and narrow it down. The narrower it is, the better. Because let's be honest, would you rather have people who are living in San Clemente or wanting to move and buy a house in San Clemente listen to your podcast that is about real estate in San Clemente? Or would you rather have randos listening to your podcast that may not ever become a client of yours, who may never even move to San Clemente, California, who may never even buy a house? And so to wrap all that up, and what I'm saying is, it's better to have 100 listeners who are potential clients than 1,000 who will never buy from you. And that's in regards to anything you sell or do or whatever your product is. Even if you're a local coffee shop in Southern California or in a specific city, that's what your podcast should be about. It should be about the community, coffee, and your coffee shop, and the people who work in your coffee shop, your customers, that kind of thing. Because the people who are going to listen to that, or the people who want to listen to that, are going to be people who live in your community, who want to buy from you, who want to purchase from you. So again, before you hit record, figure out what your podcast is going to be about. It's going to make things so much easier as far as planning your podcast. It's going to make things easier as far as getting guests on. Who are you going to have on as a guest? It's going to make your podcasting life that much easier when you have a specific niche. That word's going to just mess me up this whole episode, and I'm sorry, but a niche or a niche, whatever. But I do like to say the niches, nope. I like to say the riches are in the niches. That's what they say. So that's that. That's what I mean. Get a niche, get it figured out. Once you do that, it's going to be so much easier to hit record and to publish that episode. So why do general podcasts fail? There's a lot of reasons, but being broad, being general feels safe, but it's the quickest way for your podcast to fail. Don't be broad, don't be general, right? You know, a beginner podcaster thinks, oh, I'm just going to get on here and talk about whatever. I'm going to talk about everything, because then more people will listen. Got to be honest with you, after having my own podcast for 10 years and doing this, I did that, and I did that for too long. And sometimes even I still do it. I'm not perfect, but that's when people are going to tune out, because that's what people come for, is something specific. People go to YouTube and they search certain things. People go to podcasts to search certain things. So if your podcast is about the real estate market in San Clemente, people know right off the bat what you're going to be talking about. And those are the listeners you want. Like I said before, you don't want random listeners who aren't going to buy from you, who aren't going to buy your product, who aren't going to help you find a house, or who aren't going to want you to help them find a house in San Clemente. And so narrow it down, because the more general you are, the worse it's going to be for many, many reasons. Okay? And attention doesn't work that way. Like, that's not why you watch your favorite TV show, because it's so general. It's so all over the place. That's not why you watch a movie, because it's a guy who wants to save the world, but then he's got a job at a post office and he delivers mail for half the movie and talks to the people he delivers mail to. I don't know. I just threw that out there. It might not make any sense. It makes sense in my head. And so, again, like I said, niche it down. Be specific, because you are going to tune out listeners, and people who may have listened to your first episode are not going to come back. And so, sure, think about it this way. You have a podcast about life, business, and motivation at work. That is super general, super, super general, right? So make it a little different. Maybe you live in a small town and you want your podcast to be a podcast that helps small town business owners use podcasts to grow more customers. Done. Simple. You know what the podcast is about and what you're going to be talking about. It's going to be talking about helping small town business owners get more business and start a podcast to create content for their business, right? People come and listen to your podcast. People go to YouTube and search things because they want a solution. So think of it in that way, is that you have a solution to their problem. That's going to get more people to come. And I get it. There's comedy podcasts, entertainment podcasts. Those are different. What I am specifically talking about are podcasts for people who have a small business, who want to start a podcast because they see a problem in their community and they can solve it. And that problem might be as simple as people wanting to go to a locally owned coffee shop because they want to help people in their community who own that coffee shop. They don't want to go to a Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts because for whatever reasons. That's how that works. And that's what I mean by that. So clarity beats variety. The more out there and random you are, like I said, it's going to be harder for you to keep the podcast up and keep doing it. And it's going to be harder for you to gain traction and get followers. So the more clear you are, the more specific you are, the faster your podcast will grow. So let's think of it this way. You have a general podcast about everything and anything, and you have a niche podcast about something specific. With a general podcast, if you want to start, it's going to be harder for people to describe it. It's going to be harder for you to describe it in one sentence. You should be able to describe your podcast in one sentence of the solution you have for the problems that people have is really the best way to explain it. And so if it's more general, if it's all over the place, it's harder to market, it's harder to remember. And the other thing too, with a general talk show, when you go into to post or publish your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, they ask for a category for your podcast to go in. And so if your podcast is about everything, there's not a category for everything. It's pretty specific. It's like your podcast is about sports. Okay, what sport is it? It's basketball. So it's going to be easier for you, again, in that sense, and just easier to market, easier for people to find. And that's why you need to have a niche. It is so much easier for people. And it's instantly clear as to what your podcast is about. It's easier to promote and share, and it's going to build loyalty and listeners way, way faster than a podcast about random stuff. Okay? It's also going to speed things up of people wanting to listen to your podcast, just as simple as word of mouth, because podcasts are very popular. And so, like, for instance, the other night, somebody was asking, it was on New Year's Eve, was asking, oh, what kind of podcast do you listen to? Okay, well, I listen to a lot of sports podcasts, specifically NBA, basketball podcasts, and I also listen to business podcasts about growing small businesses. And the woman I was talking to listens to crime podcasts. Okay, specifically what kind of crime podcasts? Okay, so whatever it might be, whether it's fraud or murder or bank robberies, it's specific. It's easier to talk about. It's easier to tell people about. Oh, yeah, I have this new podcast. It's about the Oklahoma City Thunder. Done. Easy. Okay, I know what that's about. Rather, oh, it's about the NBA. Okay? It's not going to work. So when someone knows exactly who your podcast is for, they're going to know exactly who to recommend it to. And so having a niche podcast is going to help you create more listeners, bring in more clients, more customers, because you are clear about what you do and what your podcast is about. Especially if you're doing a podcast for a small business, just think of it that way. What's your small business? I own my own ice cream shop. Great. Then your podcast, if you want to start one, should be about running a business, what that's like, and your ice cream. Done. People will know exactly what it is, and they'll decide if they want to listen or not. You can't force people to listen to your podcast. And I think that's what I am going through with all of this, with being general or having something specific. I think people, especially I've done this, where, if I talk about everything, maybe I'll hit on this piece and people will listen. Or I'll hit on this piece because I'm going to talk about the music app on a Mac. But I'm also going to talk about NBA basketball, and I'm going to talk about Labradoodles because I want to get everybody to listen. It's not going to work. It's going to make it so much harder for you, and it's just not going to grow. So like I talked about before, narrowing your topic is going to grow your audience. If I told you that my podcast was just talking about podcasting, who cares? Who's that going to help? There might be a little nugget here and there, but I've narrowed this down and I've created this niche for myself, and it's helping small business owners start podcasts. That's what I want to do. That's what my podcast is for. That's what I want it to be for. I narrow it down, helping small business owners start podcasts. That's what I want to do. And so whenever you create that podcast for a specific thing, it's going to create loyalty also, right? People are going to think that that podcast is for them specifically because you're helping them with whatever that problem is that they have, and you're giving solutions for it. And so they're more likely to subscribe, more likely to share it, and more likely to come back, which is what you want if you're starting a podcast. So I know for myself, before when I would just talk about random sports, whatever it was, like I had a podcast, which I still do, but it's now just sports. But I would talk about sports for 15 minutes, and then I would talk about life, like life lessons or whatever. They had nothing to do with anything. I just wanted to talk, and I wanted to just have something out there and try to add value. It was miserable for me. It made it so much harder to come up with ideas and things to talk about, and my podcast didn't grow. It didn't grow at all. And once I started narrowing down just sports, and specifically I had just basketball for a while, but again, this is even a perfect example of why my sports podcast isn't growing, because I'm all over the place with all the sports, which, okay, I get it. There's shows out there for that. Sports Center, any show on ESPN, they talk about all the sports, and then there's certain shows that talk about just NFL, just NBA, and that kind of thing. My podcast now, I should just narrow it down and talk about basketball, and that would really help me. But I am figuring that out with this podcast, because this podcast I actually am passionate about, with the sense of helping people start a podcast. That's what I want to do. That's where I'm at with this. And so it's relevant to the day and age we're in. Podcasts aren't going anywhere. Podcasts are created every day. But what I want to do is help those small business owners or those entrepreneurs start that podcast, but keep it going. The stat is that the majority of podcasts and podcasters stop after 3 episodes. Momentum's going, 3 episodes, and then you don't see that podcast again. And I've done that before with podcasts. I have one called Short Story Long, where I wanted to tell stories about, just stories that I have and that kind of thing. I did 1 episode because it was too broad. I was like, what? Okay, stories about what though? Everything. So that's my point. This podcast though, starting a podcast, launching a podcast for small business owners. That's what this is about. Easy, done. So an exercise that you can do for yourself if you're thinking about starting a podcast is the who, the what, and the why. Who is your podcast for? What problem do you help them solve? And why should they listen to you? Those are the 3 simple things you can do. And so again, the who, the what, and the why. So you could pause this right now, take out a pen and paper, however you do things in your notes app on your phone, and then be specific about who it's for, their age, what they do maybe for a living, where they live, that kind of thing. So for me, my example would be of who it's for is local business owners who want more visibility. That's what my podcast is about. Then the next thing step 2 would be what? What is the problem that you help them solve? What problem are you going to help your listeners solve? And so you should have one core outcome of what you help your listeners solve. Not a multitude of things right now. One thing. And so my thing too with this is starting a podcast without being overwhelmed by the tech. You don't need a ton of tech to start a podcast. And I feel like small business owners, because they're running a small business, 2, think they need all kinds of technology to start a podcast. You don't. You need a phone and a couple apps, and you can start a podcast. You don't need a good microphone, a whole studio, sound equipment, lighting. You need a phone, maybe a tripod, but for sure a phone. If you're going to do video, I recommend getting a tripod. But if you're just doing audio, you just need a phone and some apps. That's the problem I'm trying to solve for small business owners, thinking they don't have the time or the technology to do a podcast. They do. They do. It would take 30 minutes to an hour every 2 weeks, and they could crank out a podcast every 2 weeks. So that's the what for me. And then the why. Why should they listen to you? Well, for me, it's my experience, my story, and just the perspective I have on podcasting. I've been there. I've done it. I know what it takes to start one and to keep it going, to keep the momentum going. And so for me, that's why people should listen to my podcast, because not only have I started podcasts, but I've helped others start podcasts. And so that's it. It's that simple. But for you, figure out for yourself, who's your podcast going to be for? What is the problem that you want to solve for your listeners? And why should they listen to you? And so to combine it, I wrote this down. It's I help blank do blank so they can blank. So I help who do what so they can whatever that result is. So my example for that is I help small business owners start podcasts so they can attract more customers. It's that simple. That's what I want to do. So what do you want to do? Why do you want to start your podcast? What is your podcast about? So I know just from my own experience is that there are some fears about having a niche. And, some of those fears are, okay, my niche, what if I get bored or what if it's boring? It can evolve over time, especially if you have a small coffee shop, there are so many things that you can talk about. Don't just think you're only going to talk about the coffee, or you're only going to talk about, the food you make. It can expand, it can evolve, but as long as it still is about your coffee shop, or even with, being a realtor in San Clemente, talk about the city of San Clemente. What does it have to offer? You don't have to just talk about homes that are for sale in San Clemente. So as long as that, it's a few more topics, but it's still going to serve your listener. It's still going to solve problems for your listener. And so you can do that. Don't be scared that you're stuck I can only talk about coffee beans. It's not that specific of a niche. I'm sure there are podcasts out there that do that, but for your small business, talk about your small business. Because as long as it is the niche of your small business, but as long as it is also still serving and helping and adding value to your core listener, And some people might be worried, oh, my niche is too small. I want to go more general. But let's be honest, because as far as podcasts go especially for small businesses, you want to start a podcast because you want more customers, which leads to more revenue, more profit. And so a small and loyal audience is going to beat a large distracted audience every single time. I'm being honest right now. I would much rather have 100 devoted listeners to this podcast than 1,000 listeners who don't care about it. Like, okay, great. I had 1,000 people listen, but how many of those were converted into customers? Whereas if you have 100 loyal, dedicated listeners, the percentage of customers you're going to get out of that is going to be way higher than the randoms that you have listening. And so you don't need 1 million listeners at all. Sure, it's great. It might look good. We all want to be loved and liked and that kind of thing. But you don't need 1 million. You don't need millions. You just need the right people. And I would rather have the right 100 than the wrong 1,000. So to wrap this episode up, specific beats broad every time. If you're speaking to everyone, you're speaking to no one. Like I said in the beginning, it's true. Speak to one person. And that's what you need to do. And we'll get more into that with this podcast. But when you're doing your podcast, speak to one person. And that's what I'm trying to do here is like, I'm speaking to you, the small business owner who wants to maybe start a podcast, but I also know should start a podcast. This is for you. It's easier than you think. The tech is easier than you think. And so talk to that one person because they're going to tell other people about your podcast and they're going to spread the word around that your podcast is great because you help people solve whatever problem it might be. And so I'm actually working on a landing page. So with a free download, so you can get a free download of a kind of a podcast starter blueprint. And so I'll have that linked eventually and posted, but on that will be like step-by-step guide of like, who's your podcast for? Why are you doing it? That kind of thing, like we talked about. So before you, and maybe you've already started a podcast, but you're like, oh, I'm kind of confused and lost and don't know what to do. So now if you've kind of been all over the place and you're looking to, maybe you've started a podcast and you're like, man, I am broad and it's too general. You want to niche it down. It's not too late. It's not like you have to start a whole brand new podcast. Just use your current podcast and start right now. Like write down who your podcast is for and what they're going to get out of it. And if you can't explain what your podcast is about, then the people listening to your podcast aren't going to know what it's about. So write it down, figure it out. And so there you have it. That was episode 5, all about your niche. Figure it out. Don't be broad. Don't be general. Be specific. Be intentional. If you like this episode, share it. Share it with somebody who needs this, who needs just a reminder that the riches are in the niches. Such a corny saying, but it's true. You're going to be way more successful if you stick to a niche and if you have a niche.